It was a morning like any other. Richard woke up early, enjoying the tranquility of his home in a quiet neighborhood of London. The sun was shining high, illuminating the yard with its soft rays. Everything seemed absolutely normal. He opened the glass door of the living room, which led to the garden, and prepared for another day of work in his office set up on the upper floor. However, as soon as he took the first step outside, his eyes met something that made him stop abruptly. In the center of the lawn stood a creature he would never have expected to see so closely, let alone there, in the middle of his yard. A gigantic eagle, majestic and imposing, was resting on the green grass. Its feathers, deep brown with golden touches, gleamed under the morning sun. The bird's claws, sharp as blades, dug into the ground, and its piercing yellow eyes stared at Richard with a disconcerting intensity. Richard blinked a few times, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him. "Is this real?" he murmured to himself, unable to believe what he was seeing. He took a hesitant step towards the eagle, and the bird merely tilted its head slightly, without showing any intention of flying away or moving. An inexplicable chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the sight of such a large and out-of-place animal that disturbed him. There was something more. A strange feeling of urgency and mystery surrounded that encounter. Richard felt his heart racing. That eagle was not there by chance. Something inside him screamed that there was more to that appearance than he could see at the moment. What was such a large eagle doing in his yard? And more importantly, why did he feel that the bird had an unknown purpose, as if it were there for him? While the silence in the yard persisted, broken only by the occasional rustle of the eagle's wings, Richard knew that this calm morning was about to turn into something completely unexpected. Richard continued to stare at the giant eagle, his body rigid, torn between curiosity and the fear that consumed him. The creature looked back at him, as if studying him, its intense yellow eyes reflecting the sunlight. Richard could feel his heart beating fast, and a cold sweat began to form on his forehead. He took a step forward, but the eagle remained motionless, showing no fear, only a strange and almost supernatural tranquility. "I need to understand what's happening here," he murmured to himself, his words barely audible. Every movement he made was calculated, as if any sudden action might make the bird take flight or, worse, react aggressively. Deep down, something told him that this eagle was not just a lost animal. There was something deeper, a mystery that seemed to surround the imposing presence in his yard. He approached cautiously, his feet softly touching the grass, the air punctuated by the light sound of his breathing. Every step seemed to prolong the tension in the air. Just a few meters away, Richard stopped, his eyes locked on the bird's colossal stature. The sense that something was very wrong grew inside him. What if it was injured? Or perhaps it was there for a reason he couldn't understand. Without hesitating any further, he abruptly turned and ran back into the house, the sound of his feet echoing on the wooden floor as he grabbed the phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the police number. "I need help," he thought. As he brought the phone to his ear, he realized the signal was failing. He tried a few more times, but the call wouldn't go through. "Damn it!" he exclaimed out loud, slamming the phone onto the table in frustration. He looked outside through the glass door and saw that the eagle remained there, firmly, staring directly at the house, as if it knew what he was trying to do. Desperate to keep the situation under control, he went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a large piece of raw meat he had bought for dinner. With the meat in his hands, Richard returned to the yard. He knew he had to keep the eagle there, that the situation was urgent, but he had no idea how to deal with something so unusual. If he couldn't reach the police, he had to buy time. Cautiously, he threw the meat a few meters away from where the eagle stood. The bird, quick as lightning, leaped onto the piece of meat, sinking its sharp claws into the food and starting to devour it. Richard took a step back, watching the scene with bated breath. This will keep it here, for now. Even with fear coursing through his veins, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. And deep down, he knew he needed to find out what was really going on before it was too late. The tension in the air increased with every passing minute. Richard stared intently at the eagle, which was still devouring the piece of meat. With every movement the bird made, he felt sweat dripping down the back of his neck. The sound of distant sirens broke the heavy silence of the neighborhood. The police were arriving. Less than a minute later, a patrol car screeched to a halt in front of Richard's house. Two officers quickly got out of the car, exchanging puzzled glances as they spotted the imposing bird in the yard. "Sir, what's happening here?" asked the first officer, approaching cautiously. Richard took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I don't know how to explain. This eagle suddenly appeared in my yard. It's huge, and it doesn't seem to be trying to fly away." The officers exchanged another look, clearly perplexed. It was evident they weren't prepared to deal with something so out of the ordinary. "Did you feed the bird?" asked the second officer, eyeing the piece of meat. "Yes, I thought it would be a way to keep it here until you arrived. I didn't want it to fly away before we could resolve this." The first officer took a few steps towards the eagle but kept a safe distance. He picked up the radio on his shoulder and called for animal control. "This is Unit Doze. We have a situation with a large wild animal. We need a specialized team urgently." While they waited, the officers approached Richard, who couldn't take his eyes off the eagle. "Any idea where it came from?" asked the first officer, trying to gather more information. Richard shook his head. "I have no idea, but there's something strange about it. I can't explain it. It's like it's here for a reason, you know?" Before the officers could respond, the sound of another vehicle interrupted the conversation. An animal control truck pulled up at the entrance, and two specialists got out, carrying capture equipment. One of them, a middle-aged man with experienced eyes, took a quick look at the situation. "This is unusual," he said, squinting as he looked at the gigantic eagle. "We need to act fast. This bird is not common in the area, and it could become dangerous if it decides to fly or attack." The specialist instructed his team to set up a large capture net. Meanwhile, Richard continued feeding the eagle small pieces of meat, trying to keep it calm. "You're doing a good job," the specialist said to Richard. "Keep distracting it while we prepare." Richard nodded, feeling the pressure of being the only one keeping the bird under control. His heart was pounding, but he knew he had to keep going. The eagle didn't seem threatening at the moment, but any wrong move could change everything. "We're ready," announced the specialist, holding the net firmly. "On my signal, we throw the net over it. Everyone stay alert." The suspense grew as the team positioned themselves around the eagle, ready to act. Richard watched, each second more tense, feeling that this creature carried a mystery much bigger than anyone there could imagine. The seconds seemed to drag on as the animal control team prepared to capture the gigantic eagle. The lead specialist, holding the net in his hands, gave a subtle signal for the others to take their positions. Richard continued tossing small pieces of meat to the eagle, which devoured them with a voracious hunger. He barely breathed, aware that any sudden movement could end the temporary control he had over the situation. "Now!" the specialist shouted, throwing the net over the eagle. The net came down quickly on the bird, but the moment the mesh touched it, the eagle let out an ear-piercing screech, flapping its enormous wings with force. The sound echoed across the yard, causing the police and Richard to take a step back, fearing it might escape. However, the team was prepared. The nets were strong, and they soon managed to pin the bird's wings. With precise and coordinated movements, the specialists kept the eagle under control, preventing it from hurting itself as it tried to break free. After a few minutes of intense struggle, the bird finally relented, breathing heavily but no longer resisting. Richard approached, his heart still racing. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. A creature of that size being captured in his yard? It was surreal. The police, in turn, watched closely, still speechless at the unusual scene that had just unfolded before their eyes. "We got it, sir," said the specialist, turning to Richard with a slight smile of relief. "She's safe now." Richard sighed, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. He was about to thank them when something on the ground, near the eagle, caught his attention. A small metallic object attached to the bird's claw gleamed under the sunlight. "What's that?" Richard asked, crouching down for a closer look. The specialists also noticed and approached. One of the team members, wearing thick gloves, carefully removed the object from the eagle's claws, revealing a small metal tag attached to a chain. As they turned the object over, the tension in the air returned immediately. "That's a dog tag," the specialist muttered, running his finger over the engraved letters on the tag. Everyone fell silent, trying to process what it meant. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. What was a wild eagle doing with a military ID tag attached to its claws? "It must be some kind of mistake," one of the officers said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "I don't know," Richard replied, slowly standing up. "This is too specific to be a coincidence." The officer took the dog tag, examining it more closely. "We're going to need to investigate this further." Richard nodded, feeling that the mystery surrounding the eagle was deepening with every passing moment. Something strange was happening, something big, and he had the feeling that the dog tag was the key to unraveling what was really going on. "I need to know where she came from," Richard said, staring at the captured eagle, "and why she had this attached to her." The animal control specialist stepped forward, holding the dog tag in one hand. "We'll investigate this. Something tells me we're not just dealing with a lost animal. This is much bigger." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. His mind was restless, spinning around the dog tag they had found attached to the eagle's claw. That military tag might be the key to a mystery much bigger than he could imagine. He knew he couldn't let it go. Something was driving him to find out more about that enigmatic symbol. Sitting in front of his computer, Richard typed the letters and numbers engraved on the dog tag into a quick internet search. The first few pages didn't reveal much, just sites with generic information about military records. However, something caught his attention. An obscure forum with references to confidential military projects mentioned an operation called Project Skywatch. He clicked on the link, his heart racing with curiosity. The website was dark, with little information, but what was there was enough to make Richard's eyes widen. Project Skywatch was supposedly a secret military operation that used trained birds on surveillance missions. Storm, the eagle's name, was one of the code names used for these special creatures, trained for reconnaissance in hard-to-reach areas with advanced tracking technology implanted in their bodies. "Is this real?" Richard whispered as he stared at the screen, incredulous. He could hardly believe that this mystery was so closely tied to a military operation. After hours of browsing forums and searching for clues, Richard decided he needed more concrete information. The next morning, he went to the municipal library, a quiet and peaceful place he hadn't visited since his student days. He knew he might find old archives and records there that could link Project Skywatch to some official military operation. Flipping through dusty documents and microfilms, Richard found a newspaper article dated years ago. The headline was intriguing: "Secret military project shut down after several incidents." The descriptions in the article were vague, but it mentioned that several large birds, including eagles, had mysteriously disappeared after the project ended. The description of an eagle named Storm, part of the operation, matched perfectly with the bird he had found in his yard. "This can't be a coincidence," Richard murmured, looking at the grainy photo of the eagle in the article, immediately recognizing Storm. He left the library with one certainty: that eagle was much more than a lost animal. Something was deeply wrong with the termination of that project, and he needed to find out what had happened. With the documents in hand, Richard decided to go to a nearby military base, where he believed he might find answers. He wasn't sure how he would be received, but he felt he had to try. The name that appeared most frequently in the records was Captain Smith, a figure who seemed to have been central to the command of Project Skywatch. When he arrived at the base, Richard was greeted with suspicion. Two soldiers stopped him at the entrance, questioning the reason for his visit. "I'm here for information about a military project, something called Skywatch." Richard kept his tone firm, though his anxiety was growing. The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the mention of the name. "Wait here, sir," one of them said before entering the base to gather more information. Richard was left outside for a few minutes that felt like an eternity. When the soldier returned, he was accompanied by a man in uniform, with a serious expression and a demeanor filled with experience. It was Captain Smith. "What do you know about Skywatch?" Smith asked bluntly, as he observed him with sharp eyes. His voice was stern, like someone who carried secrets. Richard swallowed hard but stood his ground. "I found an eagle. She had a military dog tag attached to her claw. I did some research and discovered she was part of this project. What really happened to those birds?" The captain looked deeply at Richard, evaluating his words. After a long silence, he sighed. "Skywatch was shut down for a number of reasons that were never fully disclosed to the public," he finally said. "But we can't deny that we did things that were ahead of their time. Storm was one of our main reconnaissance birds, equipped with technology that allowed for tracking and surveillance. But something went wrong. Very wrong." His voice carried a hidden sadness. "What went wrong?" Richard insisted. Smith hesitated, but he knew Richard was already deeply involved. "The birds started behaving unpredictably. Some disappeared, others returned with damage we could never explain. We tried to shut the project down, but..." He looked at the horizon, as if reliving the past. "Not all the birds came back. Storm was one of them." Richard looked at the captain, trying to process what he had just heard. "And why has she come back now? What does it mean?" "I don't know," Smith admitted, running a tired hand over his face. "But if Storm is back, something isn't right. She must be following a route. We need to figure out where she was going." At that moment, Richard realized the investigation was far from over. They needed to find out Storm's destination, and that route would lead them to a place where much bigger answers awaited. "Let's trace her route," Richard suggested. "If we can find out where Storm was heading, maybe we can discover what she was doing." Smith nodded, sensing that, in some way, Richard was now part of the story. And together, they were about to follow a path no one had imagined revisiting. Storm's trail led them to a dense forest on the outskirts of an abandoned military base. Richard, Captain Smith, and two officers, armed with flashlights and communication equipment, followed the nearly forgotten path in silence. The tension was palpable, each step echoing in the damp ground of the forest. "We have to be careful," Smith muttered, his expression serious. "We don't know what we're going to find." The route they had traced from the tracking data in the Eagle's chip indicated that Storm was heading towards this forest before she was captured. The location was isolated, surrounded by tall trees that formed a natural dome. The closer they got to their destination, the more Richard's stomach churned. Something was warning him that this place held dangerous secrets. "We're close," said one of the officers, looking at the GPS in his hand. After a few more meters, they spotted an abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. It was in terrible condition, with loose boards and broken windows. However, what caught Richard's attention was what was around the cabin: papers, old military equipment, and a large map pinned to a wooden board, crumpled by time. "This is..." Richard began, feeling a chill as he looked closely at what was in front of him. Captain Smith quickly approached and picked up one of the documents on the ground. As he opened it, His eyes widened. "My God," he murmured, his voice filled with astonishment. "This is part of a rescue operation, a mission that was aborted years ago." Richard crouched down, picking up another paper. It was a detailed report of a mission involving Storm and other birds, indicating that they were being used to locate missing soldiers in combat. However, the mission had been mysteriously interrupted, with no further explanation. "Was this being hidden all this time?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Why did no one know about this?" Before they could discuss it further, a faint, muffled sound came from inside the cabin. A groan. Richard and Smith exchanged alarmed glances. "Someone's in there," one of the officers said, drawing his weapon. With flashlights in hand, they cautiously advanced to the rusty door. The groan grew louder, weak, as if whoever was inside was on the verge of death. Smith, taking the lead, pushed the door open, which creaked ominously. Inside the cabin, in a dark corner, lay a man on a filthy mattress, breathing with difficulty. His face was pale, and he was wearing what looked like a torn and dirty military uniform. "Help!" the man whispered, his voice weak. Richard quickly approached, kneeling beside him. "Are you military?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The man slowly nodded, struggling to keep his eyes open. "I'm Storm's trainer. She brought me back, but it's too late." Smith knelt beside Richard, recognizing the man. "It's Sergeant Martin," he said, his voice heavy with surprise. "He was part of the rescue mission. We thought he was dead." Martin coughed, each breath more labored than the last. He was too weak to say much, but he managed to murmur, "Storm. She followed her training, tried to guide me back, but I got stuck here." His eyes filled with tears. "She came back for me." Richard felt a lump in his throat. The eagle, which everyone thought had disappeared aimlessly, was following a survival instinct, returning to the original mission, to save her trainer. Everything was starting to make sense. Storm wasn't just wandering lost. She was on a mission that had failed years ago, but for her, was still not over. "We're going to get you out of here," Richard said, determined. The officers immediately called for an ambulance, and within an hour the area was surrounded by rescue vehicles. Martin was taken away, though his condition was serious, and Storm, the eagle, was being monitored and cared for by specialists. What had begun as a mystery in an ordinary backyard had now turned into a real rescue mission. In the days that followed, Richard was recognized by the authorities for his help in finding the missing sergeant and resolving what had been one of the military's most secret and complex operations. Storm, in turn, became something of a legend among the military, an eagle that, against all odds, completed her mission to the end. While watching the news one evening, with images of Storm soaring through the skies again, now in freedom, Richard reflected on everything he had experienced. He never imagined that a quiet morning at his house would lead him to be involved in something so big, so deep. The eagle, which seemed lost, had not only found her way back, but also the reason to keep flying. And Richard now felt that something inside him had changed forever.